on this subcommittee. I think it's been incredibly beneficial. I think there's been a lot of good, sound conversation, even if it's tough conversation on what we agree with, disagree with, have different perspectives, whatever that might look like. I think it's been incredibly healthy. Today is really the last day. I mean, as you guys know, we've kind of been working towards this. Ginger and I have met a couple times since then. Obviously, we met last week, and we've got today's kind of the last day. And, as we're kind of kicking off, again, just wanted to say thank you on behalf of myself and Ginger for your participation, your engagement. And I've said this to her publicly and privately, but I'll say it publicly again. I want to thank Ginger for her patience with our group, working with us, all of the hard work that she's done to make sure that our messaging is shared directly with DOE, which I have seen means a lot to us, Ginger. So thank you for your hard work. So that being said, we'll kind of pivot back to Ginger. As you guys are kind of used to the routine now, we do need to go through some of the rules is too harsh, but it's really some of the review about what the expectations for the subcommittee are. And then I want to add a couple things to that as we kind of move into putting the cherry on top of the sundae. So Ginger, you want to take it?
Absolutely. So we're here at this favorite part of your agenda one last time. Feel free to get the tissues out for this last reading of the statement. The Tennessee Department of Education is excited to work with you on this opportunity to discuss the state's formula for funding public education. Before we begin, the department would like to remind you of the following. Conversations on this topic are not intended to reflect on the current BEP funding formula. The current BEP funding formula will remain in place until a new funding formula is recommended to and approved by the Tennessee General Assembly. The public is encouraged to submit comments in writing to ensure that all communications are thoroughly documented and can be reviewed and considered in the future. Public comment is encouraged to focus on developing a new funding formula rather than revising the current funding formula. Consider what should be funded in a new funding formula and at what level. Subcommittees will be responsible for reviewing public comment and making recommendations for what should be included in a new funding formula. While all committees, subcommittees, and members of the public should feel free to communicate openly, documents and records may be subject to public inspection pursuant to the Tennessee Public Records Act and may be publicly posted or otherwise made available. All recommendations that are submitted by committees and subcommittees will be reviewed and considered, but not all recommendations will ultimately be included in the proposed new funding formula. So thank you guys for allowing me to read that at the start of each meeting, and then also taking each of those statements seriously as you all engage in conversations. And then I'd also like to just reiterate what Brad said earlier about appreciating each and every one of you all as you have engaged in this process. So I'll pass it back over to you, Brad.
Perfect. Yeah, thanks, Ginger. So we'll go ahead and move on. Obviously, there's call to order there, which we just did in a statement. And I think Ginger's probably electronically done her part on the roll call and the attendance. Seeing who all is going to be here. Actually, Director Smith, too, had sent me a text message. He's dealing with a subcommittee issue right now. So he will not be here either. But Ginger, if you want to move on to the next slide, we'll kind of on a high level kind of talk about that a little bit. So if you want to go ahead and move on to the next one. So Anna, your ears must have been burning because when your email sent, the last email you sent, I literally was talking about that and just updating some things. The conversation around, I kind of want to hit a reset button here because it's our last reset, but it's probably the most significant reset here. And Carol, to your point, I think Carol was spot on. One of the things that Ginger and I have been tasked with, you saw the feedback directly from Department of Education around dyslexia and 504s and some of those conversation pieces. One of the things that we want to be able to do when we share this final documentation, this final feedback with DOE, is create an area where those conversations become parts of the solution that maybe we suggest as far as feedback, and really stay aligned on what the intention of the final document is going to look like from the BEP funding model. And I think it's obviously easy for us and understandable for us to get pulled into policy and pulled into execution in the complexities of what we do for students with disabilities and students with gifted abilities. But I wanted to thank Anna and others that submitted that. That is something that Ginger and I actually had a conversation about. We reviewed it. Obviously want to make sure that we're going to be able to share that with DOE in the feedback portion of the solutions page that they have asked us to provide after we send in this final document. I would ask as best we can, as we're navigating and moving through some of these policy discussions, that we keep that in mind, that we're already tracking that, and that we don't keep revisiting that single topic, albeit important, and miss some other opportunities really to provide good feedback around what's this final document want to look like. And again, I appreciate all of the feedback was incredibly important, is being documented. In fact, we got an email before Ginger and I had a conversation this morning that we sent another one to DOE today from a parent that has actually been listening to our meetings and providing feedback, and we've been sharing that same thing. So as we're moving forward in the policy part, please just keep that in mind, that we really need to wrap up a lot of this discussion and try not to get deep into the weeds with the 504 plans. Again, very important, but we don't want that to dominate the conversation if there's other areas that we might miss, because we only get one bite at this apple. So I gracefully ask you to just remember that as we've talked about it, and make sure that we stay focused on some of the funding and what that's going to look like. And then how potentially, obviously, that could impact some of the things that we're providing as solutions. So Ginger, do you want to add anything to that I might have missed as we move forward?
No, I think I'll just kind of reiterate what you shared of, like, we know that there is some very specific feedback that the group has shared throughout, and that's definitely something we want to pass along. And then also think about what other areas that we may want to be able to push in on in that same place to offer some additional solutions. And then I know some other people had some areas that they specifically wanted to talk about today as well that we want to make sure we get to.
Yeah, perfect. Thanks, Ginger. So if we want to go ahead, Ginger, and move forward, if we need to move to another slide, or if you guys want to pull up a lot of what Ginger had submitted around recommendations and feedback and some of the things that we've tallied, we can do that now. So Ginger, you want to give a second, or do you want to add anything to that?
We can let groups just pull up the previous information. This is our last slide
Yeah,
for today, just
okay.
to kind of focus the conversation. So I'll stop sharing my screen in case it's helpful for people to actually be able to see each other a little better.
Yeah, that's perfect. So if you guys have access, I know a couple folks were in the car. Those that are actually on a desktop or laptop or whatever you're using, if you want to pull up the feedback and the recommendations, let's go ahead and do that, and then we can kind of go through some of that, Ginger. My computer's acting kind of funny, Ginger. I'm trying to play it cool because I'm not on camera either, but I'm having a hard time with my email to pull up those documents. If you don't mind maybe pulling those up as I maybe even try to reboot if I need to, I would be really appreciative of that.
Okay, do you want me to pull up the recommendations from our last meeting or the policies and discussion for today?
Yeah, let's pull up the policy and discussion for today. So kind of what I'd like to do for the group is just kind of have that maybe in front of you, but we're kind of moving on past that to the policies portion now for myself and Ginger. So if the group that's on the camera or on the computers rather can pull up the recommendations, Ginger, if you don't mind pulling up the policy part, we can kind of track from there. And then I think kind of what we'll do is just open the floor again to the conversation. I know there's going to be a lot of feedback there, and I'll be very honest. I share this with Ginger. I also want to make sure that we hear from some folks that have not been able to contribute. Some of the folks in the education field, others that might have a lane that I'm not familiar with, or the parents might not be as familiar with. That you can kind of provide some expertise around impacts in your district and in your school system as we submit these, because we will obviously want to make sure that we're getting good feedback from everybody. And I think everybody on this committee, we're kind of each other's blind spots, making sure that we see all of the angles instead of sometimes just seeing our own angle, and the sun blinds us. So I think that'd be helpful. Yeah, if you want to pull that up, Ginger, that'd be good. And we'll kind of go ahead and jump in there and get started. You want to scroll up a little bit too, Ginger? Was there any more on that one, or was there? Okay, perfect. There you go. So Ginger can kind of scroll through that, but if we really, there's a lot on it, and I understand that, but this is our opportunity maybe to go through this and have this conversation around policy and what that's going to look like. Again, this is our chance to really be able to submit back to DOE our final findings is probably the wrong word, but our final discussion points as far as value. And of course, we remember all the buzzwords we've been talking about with base funding and weighted funding and things like that. This is going to be the portion today that's going to dominate most of this discussion, if not all this discussion, for probably the next 40 minutes. And so as we're going through that, these are feedbacks, obviously, that we've seen that have been shared. I think that's important, again, for us to look at. Some of them do impact us. Obviously, some of them may not impact us much, but they're all going to be relative to the discussion today around policy and kind of how we're going to submit that. And then obviously there's solutions portion that I mentioned that we're going to submit behind that. Again, characteristics of dyslexia, some of those conversations we have historically had, I think are going to fall in there too. So Ginger, I think what I'd like to do is maybe if there's any baseline that you want to share with us that we need to look at, we can go ahead and do that. If not, I think we'll probably go through this and work together as a group to get feedback around the policy, the reflection, some of the submissions that we're going to need, and kind of check off those boxes as we go, and then leave enough time at the end, maybe for a final review of what we're going to submit, and then make sure everybody's on board with that or comfortable with that, and then kind of be on, maybe move on in a final submission at that point. Does that work for you?
Yeah, so I'm going to recap quickly and make sure we're all on the same page. So we have
Sure.
sort of two tasks for us in front of us. One is to, we have one solution on the table for the characteristics of dyslexia piece, but we also need to think through what might be an additional solution for that we want to pose as well. So that's one conversation. And then the other conversation would be the subcommittee policies, reflection, and feedback that I'm sharing on my screen right now and you all have in front of you. Some of these policies, this group may be able to speak more about than others. And so those are ones that I think we can jump into and see what suggestions you all may have on those policies. We do not have to hit every one of these because some of these may be outside of like this group scope, and that's totally fine.
Yeah, so I'll kind of stop there as you guys are getting your bearings. Are there any questions or concerns? I want to make sure everybody's on the same page as we're moving through this because we will really only get one shot at this. Are there any questions or comments or concerns about kind of our next steps in this meeting? I'm checking to see if there's any hands raised in the chat, and that's kind of what I'll use as a gauge. If not, we'll go ahead and move forward. Because Ginger just kind of laid that out. There are going to be some policy ideas, policy discussion points that don't impact us, and that's okay. Don't feel like because we see 15 policy conversations on there that we have to comment or add feedback relative to those. If it's not applicable, that's okay. We don't have to do that. And obviously, Ginger can allude to that when we submit it, that there was not feedback from our subcommittee on that. So let's go ahead and jump into it, Ginger. I'll if you want to go down that list, I'll try to be quiet and we'll see if we get some feedback from the subcommittee on the different ideas of the policy.
So I'm going to defer to you guys and let you kind of look through that left column, the policy idea section, and see if there are ones there that you all, someone wants to throw out as one that you all feel comfortable and knowledgeable to discuss as a group. Wendy, jump in there.
Yeah, the one that jumped out at me that I would love for us to weigh in on is on the funding year. I think particularly for all kids with disabilities, but particularly kids with higher needs and higher costs associated with those. There is, I think, a higher degree of moving around. And so using the prior year really discourages, it makes it harder for schools to meet the needs of the student if a student happens to change schools, or even if it's from one grade band, from elementary to middle or high. So I would really love for us to have some input on how that needs to reflect the current reality. And then I'll add on a layer on top of that for fast growing districts. For example, the Charter Commission district, I serve on the Charter Commission, are some of our charter schools. It's really hard for them to use the prior year because they're growing a grade or more a year, and that changes things dramatically too. So I'm not sure how the current year, I don't know what the like I don't know how quickly you can figure out current year numbers if you use October 1st ADM or what, but I feel like it's a really important thing for kids with disabilities.
Yeah, good point. And I wanted to ask something real quick before I go to you, kind of along those lines that you're referencing, Wendy. If any of our superintendents are on, I'm really curious, kind of one of those things there in that third line about receive the funds in real time to meet the costs of that year. Are there resource requirements there that districts would need to be able to do that, that it would increase local costs there? And I'm just curious because I do think there is some value, Wendy, in that conversation happening about if we know the needs in real time, if there's a flexible way to meet them with dollars, there might be strong value in saying, let's do that. But I don't know if that puts a burden on smaller districts that don't have personnel. So is one of the superintendents. Yeah, whoops, I'm sorry. Go ahead. I just saw you jump on there, David. Go ahead.
Yeah, so I think so. We don't necessarily, in the state special schools, don't struggle with this because we receive our funding differently, right? So, but I do know in my conversations with, and I work with all the superintendents throughout the state because we serve their kids. Those high cost reimbursables, all of that stuff is a year behind. So with smaller districts, especially the rural districts that can't, I call it riding the float, right? So they can't float those. It's difficult for them to float those funds because they just don't have the funds to float. So if they get a student with significant needs that come into their district, then all of a sudden they have to meet the needs of that student, but they don't have the resources. With vision, it's, they may have one vision student in that district, so they don't have a vision teacher. So in order to meet, we help out with that a lot of times, but they're behind a year, and that really creates, especially for those smaller districts, significant funding issues.
Yeah, no, that's a good point. Thanks for sharing that. Anna?
I echo Wendy. I think we saw a lot in the comments too about that flexibility for kids with specific learning disability. They're transitioning from RTI to characteristics of dyslexia to maybe 504 or IEPs. So that flexibility does need to very much be built in. Also, going back up, Wendy beat me to it. Up ahead, one of the policies is summer tutoring, I believe, for third grade, maybe a page up. And I would just say that we have a lot of concerns about that from the specific learning disability. Stop right there. The below on third grade tutoring, requiring this tutoring, that's a huge issue for kids with disabilities who are kind of getting caught in that third grade retention and some of that mandatory third grade tutoring, because it doesn't necessarily have to be dyslexia specific. So this is a huge thing for our community around that tutoring. So I would like to put in a note there to ask additional questions about that, because that's a policy issue for sure in our community.
Walk me through that a little bit deeper, Anna. When you're saying more questions, are you saying expand the conversation around tutoring to be more than just students with dyslexia, or are you saying they're not doing enough now?
Sure. No, I think there are two things happening. I think they're mandating tutoring for students in the summer, but they're not necessarily pairing that with interventions they need in the summer. And then also we're at that third grade threshold about that they're going to start holding back kids in third grade and retaining those kids if they're not on a certain level of kind of this below score that this is showing here. So that they're going to retain kids, which unduly harms students with disabilities. So I just want to put a note in that policy. We need to make sure this isn't discriminatory against students with disabilities when we're talking about tutoring.
Right, even indirectly, a program that's trying to be designed to help couldn't harm it through those sorts of targeted numbers that might impact our population. I got you. I think I got it. So let's go back to that just real quick, Wendy, if we can. To Wendy's, I kind of want to get a quick vote there. Is it a general consensus for the subcommittee around real-time funding as opposed to the previous fiscal year or previous calendar year for the schools? that we think there needs to be more of a real-time approach. I see Wendy raise her hand right away. Is that to vote yes or to talk, Wendy? I'm sorry.
It was to vote yes, and I was just putting in the chat, but I just, since I had a chance, maybe I see one of the concerns is lowered enrollment and districts having to go through that, which I think is one of the things you were looking for feedback on. And so maybe there's a way, if we do agree to recommend same year numbers to do the calculations, that there's some sort of threshold, like if the district falls under 90, I don't know what the number would be, but a certain percentage of the prior year's enrollment, that they would still be able to have that threshold, and then that maybe addresses some of the concern. I don't know.
Yeah, no, it's a good point that it's almost becomes that safety net to create and I know Commissioner Schwinn has been very open to us about, listen, we don't want to hurt any student. So it doesn't have to be, they're working their best to make sure it's not, well, it's either this or this. There can be, mixed conversations that are happening around what's best for the child. And it might be some of those things there that there's built-in safety nets that also give flexibility around real-time spending. So I think just about most of the hands went up on that, Ginger, around that really being something that's important in our community was the funding model and the current funding model. David, was that a hand raised just to say yes, or did you have some comments to add to that?
That was just a yes.
Perfect. And Carol, was yours comments or just a yes?
No, that was a yes. I think doing the current year makes a great deal of sense. And there's probably, I'm thinking about sort of how the feds do child count and deliver IDEA money. Do you know?
That,
And there might be some models to kind of look at that in terms of doing child count or taking a snapshot of people a couple times during the year so that you can kind of do current funding, and then you can kind of write it at 6 months or something. Just an idea.
Well, maybe even to piggyback off that, Ginger, again, specifically for our population on the disability community side, that might be a conversation we have about TEIS and early intervention as students are rolling into the Part B and Part C, and maybe using some of those numbers as a projection on enrollment. So Wendy, I don't know if that's what you were getting at, but maybe that's another conversation, Ginger, to have relative to the potential impact of those students coming into a school district and funding that might stay attached to those students before they actually get into the public schools, because they might be utilizing public school resources relative to early intervention. So that's a whole nother conversation. But to Carol's point, maybe that's something we think about down the road as we're working on implementing. So Lynette, did you have your hand up, or was that a yes vote? I'm sorry, I know I'm a broken record. I want to make sure I'm not missing anybody.
It's a yes and.
Okay.
So our federal law for our funding has in it what's called a maintenance of effort clause, because the worst thing you want to do is have a district have their budget and have them lose dollars. So if there could just be some sort of like a maintenance of effort formula in there, I think it's absolutely yes. I wonder about the state's capacity to adapt funding, midstream for districts all over the state. But if they could figure it out, I think it's great.
Yeah, no, good feedback. Good feedback. Ginger, if maybe we want to go back up to the top and kind of universally agree on some of the ones that don't impact us, it might help us kind of focus on the ones that do, instead of maybe everybody trying to scan. Because a couple of the ones, I mean, they could potentially impact us if you don't mind. I mean, I think teacher salaries maybe impacts us, but I think that's for everybody. So I don't know necessarily if we weigh into that, but again, this isn't, we're all working together. Do we have any feedback on definition of economically disadvantaged? And I need to say something here, not to eliminate discussion, but kind of staying in our lane about students with disabilities and gifted abilities. They could be economically disadvantaged. Is that a driver in our conversations? I don't know. It might be, but just kind of think through that as we're going through some of these policy ideas. Is it within the spirit and the letter of what we've been asked to do? So I don't know that. Even definition of sparsity, I don't know if that really falls under us. Lynette, do you have some feedback on that?
I do with sparsity, only because this came up time and time again with our council members who are in the rural districts. who have, a student that has an approved plan for services, but they can't get enough of a rotation of a provider in because the providers spread out, so far over counties. So I think the definition of sparsity does have a direct impact. And I don't know how to do it, but I would encourage I like the 25 students over the 10 myself, but.
Yeah, sure.
And Lynette,
Carol.
I think that's the feedback we're looking for on this one is the federal definition is 10. And what would Tennessee want that definition to be? Do we want to stick with the federal, or would we want to define it as somewhere between 10 or to 25 or at that 25 mark?
Yep. Hey, Carol.
Yeah, so I'll just say that I think that closer to 25 makes a great deal of sense, given how rural our state is, and how many districts and what has to happen. My other comment, though, was just to get some clarity to make sure that everybody's on the same page around sort of dual or tertiary conditions, right? So theoretically, a student could qualify as a direct certification of being economically disadvantaged and also be a student with a disability who's going to have weight attached to that as well, and potentially attending a Title I school, whatever that is. I just want to make sure that we're clear on that, right? That it's kind of additive, not singular.
That's right. And I think that's one of the things that we were hoping to go through to look at to say, is this a dominant conversation piece for the subcommittee? While all of these probably have tentacles for us, is it a driver in what we're trying to do? I think obviously the funding was a huge driver for us. Economically disadvantaged probably has tentacles there, but is it a driver for us? I don't know if it is, considering the conversations we've had and where the subcommittee has at least focused their time. It hasn't necessarily been around this too. So that's a good point though, Carol. It's not necessarily just going to be one or the other. There's going to be levels and layers to this, and I think Ginger's going to be able to capture some of that too. So real quick, just to keep it moving, we're already past 2:00. I think that I think it was Lynette and Carol brought up a good point. Do we agree that maybe our perspective would be closer to 25 students in the sparsity definition? I'm seeing a lot of head nodding, so I'm going to assume that's good. Yeah, so maybe Ginger, if we want to add that as feedback from the subcommittee, to add to the number of students closer to 25 as opposed to 10. That'd be good. Any feedback really on teacher salaries? I know we've talked about that. Anything that anyone wants to share on that as far as a laying down in the road type deal? I know it's important to our group and everybody's. I think that's going to be one you're going to see from everybody, especially students that have been at home during the pandemic. There's a lot of parents obviously that are understanding even more the value of our teachers, and I know Commissioner Schwinn sees it the same way. You want to scroll down a little bit. Right, we kind of talked a little bit about the tutoring. I think Anna gave some feedback relative to that Ginger, I think you copied. I know we've talked about CTE in some of our conversations. Was there anything additional that we wanted to add to the CTE content or even feedback on how CTE is considered? I'll kind of wait for a second.
What's CTE? Remind me.
Yeah. So Ginger, do you want to give them the very dumbed down version that I will butcher, as far as standards and kind of how they do technical education and things like that? What'd you say, Anna? Say it again.
Technical education.
Yeah, it's career and technical education. And so for our population, that has been something we've talked about relative to post-secondary and secondary and development. And it's been a conversation, but I didn't know if there was anything that we wanted to add. One of the things that I'll tell you selfishly that we've done that you guys are aware of is the Tennessee Belize program. One of the things that we're hopefully looking to start talking even more about is TCAT, some of these other opportunities for our populations to be certified in technical skills for job placements and job opportunities. So I don't know, Ginger, if that really fits in here, but I did want the subcommittee to know that that's one of the things that we're meeting not only with DOE, but with the Higher Education Commission relative to opportunities for our students to participate more in career and technical opportunities in their schools. Hey, Anna.
I was just anticipating the move to K-2 weight.
What's it say? Oh, how excited are you about weighing in on the K2 weight? So we'll go ahead and go back to you for that one.
I think we've talked about that a lot here. I think that continues. Looks like the steering committee has asked us about that. And we also sat in comments for dyslexia for students who are learning sign language. I mean, there was a lot of comments from a lot of the disability community that this was how white might we consider a weight. I'm not sure technically how to do that, but I do feel like a lot of our conversation has been very much around that for students with disabilities, because that's a critical time for intervention and identification.
Well, let's even expand that, Anna, to go back to what you just said 5 minutes ago. As we're talking about the grade 3 impact that we just discussed, it puts K2 weight on the K2 investment and conversation. I think even more around tutoring and some of those things that we just talked about. Maybe there's conversations we need to have about the investment in earlier grades before our students get into grade 3 and some of those things become testing or whatever that might look like. So good point. Any other feedback on that portion of the K2 weight? I saw a lot of head nodding, but go ahead, Carol.
Yeah, so I'll just say that I think that that Anna is spot on. I mean, I think, and we did have conversations in other meetings that may or may not have been captured entirely, but the fact that if we can do preventative work up front in early intervention in pre-K and in K through 2, that's really critical. And I think that it would be good for this committee to kind of put a stake in the ground about weighting that to try to prevent or ameliorate kids going into special education when they don't need to.
Yeah. No, good point. Hey, go ahead, Leanne.
When we're looking at those K2 weights, like they just said, that is an important area, but I think we also, can we put something in there or make sure some of that additional investment is for some remediation, to catch the needs, but we also need some enrichment there. If we're pushing kids and giving them educationally higher end stuff as well, it can't just be all focused on remediation. We've got to give our high achieving K2 kids a chance to fly as well.
Mm-hmm. No,
I agree.
Good point. Really good point. Thank you. I'll kind of wait a second, see if anyone else wants to add in on that. That's a really good point. Leanne, thanks for bringing that up.
So the feedback here would be that you all would like to see those weights for the K2 to ensure that there's additional intervention and supports that are provided, but also the enrichment pieces as well. I think the feedback we provided last time was the pre-K through third grade band moved up, but also within that included language for gifted students, I think was how it was worded last time. So any thoughts on how we might think about that follow-up piece for the weight? So when we think about being able to audit that piece, what might that look like for K2? So what would we say for K2? Are we just saying overall, if you serve grades K2, that's a weight, or is there something else you all would tie to that specifically?
I would argue that it's an overall K2. That if we really want to invest early on behalf of kids, of all kids, right, to try to make sure that everybody has the foundation they need as they move forward, all the way from remediation to enrichment and everything in between. So I would just weight it generally.
And I feel like we could do it. I mean, I'm a broken record, but with RTI, we're already gathering all that information. So we're going to have kids with characteristics of dyslexia. We're going to have kids who are at the higher end through enrichment. So that whole system is already built in. So we could also do it through tiers. But the department doesn't seem to like that information very much. But that's my 2 cents.
Any other feedback on that portion for Ginger? Okay, let's go ahead, Ginger. We'll kind of scroll down there. And this area gets pretty expansive right here, but I certainly want to make sure we focus on that because everybody, I think sometimes has different ideas around outcomes. But are there any generalities that we agree as a group, or even specifics? It doesn't mean that we need to not do that. Wendy, you have something to add to that?
I'm not sure this is what this is supposed to mean, but while I don't want to speak for all of the disability community, obviously, but while I, as a member of the disability community, feel strongly that funding should be directed towards things that provide better outcomes for kids, I worry that tying funding to outcomes, at least without some sort of really strong guardrails, just incentivizes the dumbing down of the IPs or whatever you're using to test for those outcomes. And so I would propose that we have some language that strongly reminds people that tying it to outcomes, you need to make sure exactly how you're doing that, or else you're going to incentivize schools to, put in an IEP that a child will do something and there will be a much lower outcome than what the child should be able to actually do.
Right. Yeah, and maybe, and again, I don't want to put words in your mouth, but not necessarily have funding tied to outcomes that traditional populations might say, well, this is good. I mean, you guys know this. Our children, with how they accomplish things, there's big deals that they accomplish that are positive outcomes that traditional student models or communities might not look at as a big deal. Well, that's a big outcome, and that needs to be funded that way and treated in that same manner. But again, I don't want to interject or put my words in place of your words.
Yeah, no, that's a whole other concern also, right? Using the typical measures for outcomes for kids with disabilities. If that were to result in less funding for those students, that would be a real travesty. So I completely agree.
Yeah, it's an interesting point because we certainly want inclusion in public schools and those conversations, and the understanding about outcomes need to look different for different children, and not in a discriminatory way or an exclusionary way, but being able to have those conversations around funding to say we need to keep funding consistent, and not necessarily let outcomes drive that funding. Anna, did you raise your hand? Did I see that?
I've already moved on to accountability. I'm sorry, I get excited.
No, I like it. I like the trigger finger there. Carol, were you raising your hand to affirm, or did you have some
I was just going to second what Wendy said. I mean, I think we need to be very, very cautious about outcomes because of the broad, need of students to be sort of individualized, and you don't want to punish kids for, lack of outcomes and get the consequences that Wendy describes. Thanks.
Sure. Lynette?
I'm sorry.
Yeah, I'm coming at it from a different angle. I'm wondering if we can flip it and have the outcomes be the outcomes of the school. Something like certain percentage of teachers taking a certain type of training related to disability, or I'm having a wonderful idea with no examples to support it, but can the outcomes be flipped to something that moves an individual school forward rather than because you're totally right, that's it.
No, it's a good point because there might be models that we're able to tie in there to encourage school districts to engage our population in a more direct manner, and better understanding about promoting opportunities for students with disabilities and gifted students, and a conscious effort or a real effort from schools to engage our population and what that might look like, in educating or even educating the educators on those types of needs and those types of conversations that need to happen. It's a good point. Wendy, and then I'll jump to you if you've got anything to add too.
I may wind up looping to Anna, but I agree with that as long as those outcomes are not going to disincentivizing high expectations for kids. But I'll just say, I think it's important if we point this out that we are worried about tying outcomes to funding, that we need to be really clear that we do expect high accountability, which is that, there have to be accountability systems. I just don't think that the funding piece needs to be tied to it.
Is part of that.
For purposes of kids with disabilities. Yeah.
Sure. No, good point. Leanne?
Speaking as a teacher, I'd like where you all are going with this, but the outcomes, anytime you are basing an outcome for an adult on the performance of a child, you need to steer clear of that. I think incentivizing teachers to get training based on the training they're getting, absolutely. Schools to promote, information, training, understanding of disabilities, all of those things, absolutely. But, sort of like the system that we're hanging on now, where teachers are evaluated based on, a 7th grade student's willingness to take a test at any given time. I think those are we're talking about incentivizing things based on what a student does reflected toward a teacher. That's not a good practice from somebody who's in this situation.
Sure. No, good feedback. Thank you, Leanne, for that. Yeah, that's a lot there, Ginger. You need a second to document a lot of that, or do we need to maybe move on in? I think you said you were raising your hand around accountability, so I want to make sure we give everybody a chance to talk outcomes if there's any more follow-up from that.
So I think just to summarize, raising the concern that funding tied to accountability needs safeguards so it doesn't adversely impact students with disabilities, and then looking for ways to define outcomes that would move a school, for example, percentage of teachers receiving training for how to meet the needs of students with disabilities through accommodation services or what have you. Just as a quick summary, obviously we have the recording for all of the nuts and bolts of the conversation.
Right. All right, we got about 15 minutes and we still have probably 6 or 7, I think, to go, Ginger. Accountability. Anna, do you want to add something to that?
I think this is one area, like Wendy already mentioned, that we really need, that we really need to stake a claim for students with disabilities, because talking about individual outcomes for these students, there has to be accountability. I don't really have necessarily a great measure to do, but I think this is extremely important for us to show that the money is being spent for the thing that individual child needs.
Yeah, and I think honestly, Anna, it's going to sound like I'm pushing back on you, but I'm hoping Ginger will understand what I'm saying here. If we do believe this, and I think most of us do, we need to have suggestions for them, and even if it's a rough draft format, to say something along the lines of what you just said. Confirmed documentation of the IEP goals, or something that's already there, but you'd really drive that home around the accountability to say, hey, it's got to be more than just somebody says, yeah, they did this. There's got to be something that's built into that. So I'm not sure what all of the school districts are doing right now, but I think your point's well taken, that there has to be tangible and real levels of accountability that are visible. And I think maybe that's what you're getting at, is how do we know that's happening, right? And it can't just be somebody saying it happened.
Right. And I think it could directly be tied to kids with IEPs, to those goals, more specifically to accommodations. That gets extremely lengthy for kids with accommodations, especially kids who are relying on assistive technology. For kids with 504 plans, you can do something similar. For characteristics of dyslexia, you can absolutely do that. They have to show that they're giving dyslexia specific intervention. So I feel like that is a way, but that is also, there's so many different disability categories. With gifted students, you're going to want to provide that they've been given so many hours of access to some of those mentors, to those more higher end classwork. It's pretty in the weeds, I think, for every individual student, but that may be what we need to do, since they are thinking about this auditing process. But that has to be something that we consider very specifically, because all of this money, especially for those kids who have multiple disabilities, I really want to stake that here too, that we need to make sure we're addressing all of the disabilities. And like Carol said, if we have a kid who's, in a rural area, who's poor, who has autism, we need to be making sure that all that money is going to that child.
Yeah. Oh, good feedback.
Oh, also, I just got text from Lori, who is here, but said, ask Ginger to let me in. I can hear, but I can't see her talk.
Oh,
It's
really?
different.
She's in here. Lori
Okay.
Smith?
You're
Yeah,
here.
Lori's in here.
All right. Well, maybe you muted her for a reason. Just kidding, Lori.
Yeah, that's funny. Yeah, it's funny you said that because I just checked to say to see if I accidentally muted her, but she's showing as present.
Yeah, and I can't unmute her. Like, I don't have the ability to unmute her. She has to unmute herself.
Yeah,
She's
She
pretty
might-
sad. Figure it
I
out.
can't either.
I was gonna say she might try. Maybe.
Ginger, I think you muted yourself there actually, so that was kind of funny.
She's
Yeah.
okay. She's listening. She'll let me know. She'll send me any questions she has. So carry on.
Okay, perfect. That's good. Yeah, so let's keep scrolling down there then. We did, I think universally talked about funding year, so that's good. Any feedback or comments about reporting as far as what school districts might need to report from the financial side? Again, that's a financial side there that they're asking about. Any thoughts or comments there? I didn't see any, so we'll kind of move on. You want to scroll down for me, Ginger? I think this is the last page that we're moving to. So right there, I don't remember if it was you, Lynette, but there's a maintenance of effort right there as well at the local level. And I think you might have been talking about that. There's a balance there. You can kind of see how should we consider maintenance of effort at a local level. Provides consistent funding, but may deter local investment because of the requirement to continue. What might that look like? Because I think that could hit us. I know, I think it was actually David that was talking about that being at a local level. David, do you guys have any impact in your schools or understanding about what that impact might be at a local level, or any of the superintendents that might be on here? Is there concern about impact there?
So, you mean meeting the maintenance of effort at the local level?
Yeah, because I know, just speaking in my old life from a county commission perspective, there's always concern about, is the state going to keep pushing funding requirements down to counties that can't afford it? And if they do, how do they start? Sometimes their only way to fix that is raising property taxes or something like that. So it's kind of that point of is how should they consider what the maintenance of effort looks like at local level? Does it need to be based on income? Does it need to be based on ability? Do rural counties receive more that have a lower student population? Do they receive more because it might be more students with disabilities, or more
Well,
students that don't speak English? What does that look like?
I think, well, right now the rule is you just have to spend as much or more that you did the previous year to meet maintenance of effort. At least that is for federal dollars. And
Yeah.
I would assume it would be the same for state dollars. Again, our funding model looks a little bit differently, so it's not as easy for me to speak about that, because again, our funding, we get direct funds from the state. Our local dollars are state dollars
Yeah.
at the state special schools.
And that's a good point. This isn't, this one's not, I don't know if this is a disqualifier necessary for this group to say we have to have something. I was just wanting to make sure, given that it impacts some of the folks that are directly in the schools, and understand it a little bit more as far as how the funding model works. If there's anything that we wanted to weigh in on.
I think ultimately, though, there's going to have to be multipliers in there for those distressed counties and counties that have less of a means because of their tax base.
Yeah.
Because they still have to, it still costs you still have to educate the children in that district. And so those funding levels need to be equal to the kids in a poor district shouldn't get shortchanged because they live in a poor district.
Yeah, sure.
So.
No, good point. Anyone else, any other comments on that? I think that was probably it, Ginger. We can probably scroll down. We got about 6 minutes. And then I think right there, obviously, development and training. I know we've talked some about that with some of the folks. Leanne, I think you even mentioned kind of like the idea around schools and how they're doing, encouraging outcomes by developing folks professionally or even in the schools. Any comment there? Go ahead, Anna.
We saw this a lot in the last batch of comments, that there was a lot of desire for this professional development around individual disabilities so that all of our teachers and administrators can be more sensitive to the individual needs of students in the classroom. So I just wanted to put that there, that that's something we've seen in our community.
No, that's important. Yeah, that's important. I think that's a big one to add to. Now the challenge becomes what do we add to that, or what do we think it might look like as far as a solution or a suggestion. I'll kind of pause there. This might be the last thing we actually cover, so probably worth a couple minutes thinking about that. You know, looking at other states that do it and maybe tie in some things to that. I'm not sure what some of the other states do. I know that we've had some folks that have researched that, but maybe there's opportunities for us to kind of create our own Tennessee model that we think would value gifted students and children with disabilities in the professional development of teachers. Because I think it's going to continue to grow. There's going to continue to be opportunities for our population in the school districts. And we're obviously going to want to make sure that we have teachers adequately prepared for that and development opportunities to make them be the best teacher that they can be, because that ultimately impacts outcomes and everything we've been talking about on the front end. All of that is impacted by development. Anna?
I think we do have some local partnerships in our own state with TAG for some of the gifted kids. We have MTSU Center for Dyslexia, where they're already doing a lot of these, and I'm sure there's others in the disability community. So maybe if we could even think about putting forward some of the communities that we're aware of for the disabilities. You know, I know there is like Bridges for students who are hearing impaired and deaf. So of places that offer those kind of interventions for teachers that districts could use as resources for crafting professional development would be a first relatively easy step for our council and for our community to provide to the district.
Good feedback.
Department.
Anna, thanks. Carol?
Yeah, I think that's a really good suggestion, sort of how to operationalize some of this. But I think we talked in some of our previous meetings about the need in particular situations for particular kinds of certification. And I don't know exactly how it fits into a funding formula, but it seems to me that there ought to be some ways to incentivize getting some of those certifications to make sure, so that if people get a supplement. I don't know if a certain number of teachers have that kind of certification. And I know that costs something up front, but you know, if there's a way for them to recoup that and then get a little more, for example, built into that formula, it seems to me that incentivizing additional training, incentivizing that certifications, et cetera, would be an idea.
It's a good point. I mean, maybe there's ways to tie in dollars to that funding model to say we want to incentivize people getting better. And not maintaining status quo, and that's part of it. So good point there, Ginger. Maybe we need to tweak that to encourage, you know, financial things that challenge teachers to do some of these things that historically they might have had to have done, but they weren't rewarded for it, and that tends to lessen your effort. I would imagine, at least for me, if when I was playing sports, my coach said you have to do this. Didn't necessarily make me want to do it until I knew there was a reason why that helped me, and then it was a motivator. So good point, Carol. Anybody else? We are running right up on the clock right now, and I want to make instructors aware of the Grow Your Own. Yeah, there. So Mandy put part of that professional development opportunity about Grow Your Own in the comment section too. So I will kind of stop there. And Ginger, I'll let you wrap us up. I didn't realize an hour flew by today. I didn't realize that it was running up on this, but Ginger, you want to add anything? Again, I just, before I pivot to Ginger, I can't tell you how much I appreciate your feedback. I can tell this subcommittee directly that I spoke to Commissioner Schwinn a week or so ago, and she mentioned how engaged it appeared our committee was and how much she appreciated it, that she had read everything that we had been submitting, and wanted me to tell you how much she appreciated your stakeholder investment and engagement, community outreach, folks all across the state participating and having a conversation about this. She said to give you her best and thank you for caring about the students in Tennessee. So Ginger, I will kick it to you.
Great. So let me run through quickly the recommendations for these policy pieces, and then I'll jump into my appreciation at the end. I hate to interrupt an appreciation for running through these, but I do want to make sure I have all of these. So for sparsity, we have 25 students per square mile. For the K2 weight, overall weight for K2, these grade for overall weight for the K2 grade levels to ensure additional intervention and supports can be provided, including enrichment. For accountability, accountability measures that ensures a way to see that those funds are being used to meet the needs of students, including like services defined in the IEP, expected hours, etc. For the funding year, current year funding to support the needs that will help support the needs of students with disabilities, but there should be a threshold or a way to create safeguards for the declined enrollment that districts may experience from time to time. For professional development to support educators in understanding individual disabilities and gifted students and how to serve them, as well as funds to incentivize certification or to complete training. And then for the outcomes, kind of a separate outcomes piece is an overall concern that funding tied to accountability needs safeguards so it doesn't adversely impact students with disabilities. And then define outcomes that would move a school, such as a percentage of teachers receiving training on how to meet the needs of students with disabilities, which kind of ties back to the professional development piece that was mentioned. Do I have all of that? And did I miss something?
I think you covered most of it, Ginger. Great job. Thanks again. Obviously, I said it before, but I think you covered most of it. Now you get to do your thank yous.
Well, thank you all so much. Really appreciate your all's input. I will share this over as well as the other communication that you guys have had. Continue to share your input. We definitely want to hear from you all, and I appreciate all of the between work from meetings as well as the work that goes into each of the meetings that we have together. And it's been a pleasure to get to meet each of you virtually and just get to interact with you this way. So thank you so much. I really appreciate you guys.
Well, thank you, Ginger and Brad. It's really been helpful to have you all leading this effort, and we appreciate you.
Thanks, Carol. Appreciate you guys. Hope everybody has a great rest of your week and a wonderful 2022. We'll see you guys later. Thanks, everyone. Bye.
Take care.
Bye, everyone.